customers. And that's a race of efficiency versus compute. You know, the efficiency will keep growing, but the demand for compute will too. So it's very interesting. All NVIDIA watchers and whatnot. And I'm probably gonna head to the office at some point later. We certainly have to do our weekly call, so you guys won't be present for that. This is actually a really good story. Question of Godel. So, I guess I could tell. I could tell you guys the story of enzyme replacement therapies. So, a long time ago, there was a company called Genzyme. Let me see if I can show you a little bit of this stuff on my screen here. What's a good way to do this? Yeah, so a long time ago, Genzyme was one of the kind of foundational biotech companies, and it was a really incredible company that pioneered the rare disease industry, in essence. And Sanofi ended up buying Genzyme out, but Genzyme was kind of this like really special company. Why? Well, the biotech revolution allowed Genzyme, as you can see here, I forgot Henry Blair, that's a blast from the past. This guy Henry Tremere ended up becoming kind of like one of the main statesmen of biotech. He died 8 years ago. He was a really amazing dude. And he created the rare disease business model by charging very, very high prices for orphan drugs, allowing, basically this model of being able to treat really sick people. It allowed that model to exist, which is a really special thing because it really... Is Carisdale doing the new thing? Looks like maybe Carisdale is coming out with something today. So Dr. Brady was sort of an amazing thing here. There was a kid with Gaucher disease. Gaucher is a terrible illness where the patient can't metabolize a substrate because they're missing this enzyme. Okay, so genetic deficiency makes that enzyme unavailable. The body's not making it. So the patients can die either in infancy or young adulthood, but the symptoms are terrible. Splenomegaly, so enlarged spleen. So this is glucose cerebridase, or GCD. It just metabolizes these sphingolipids. And so if you can't metabolize them, they accumulate and they end up causing this disease. And so what they did is they started with placentas. And they harvested it from placentas. And then obviously the biotech revolution was taking place at the time where they made a recombinant version called Cerezyme. And this is like some of the first stocks I ever looked at in my life. And Cerezyme was just a gigantic win. But the company bought and created other drugs like aldurazyme and other, these are called lysosomal storage diseases. So they kept sort of creating these. They had Fabrazyme for Fabry disease, Lumazyme and Myozyme for Pompe disease. So many different, drugs like that. There was a company called BioMarin that was sort of the second place or third place lysosomal storage disease company, also making ERTs, enzyme replacement therapies. You can't make the enzyme, we'll make it and give it to you, save your life. And these enzymes can cost $300K to $1 million a year because there's only 500 or 1,000 people with the disease. So they give the enzymes and it helps the patient. The enzymes aren't perfect, by the way. So BioMarin's making enzymes too, and in fact they partner with Genzyme for aldurazyme. And they make other enzymes, and they make other rare disease drugs. They make Naglazyme for MPS 6. Very small number of patients, but they still make it one of their biggest drugs. And again, I cut my teeth trading these stocks. I even, in the 2008 recession, I partnered with some big names to potentially acquire BioMarin, which is a pretty wild idea. But 2008 resulted in lots of stocks that were on their butt. And, we thought about acquiring the whole company. Stock was like $10 or something. Anyway, BioMarin kept making these enzyme replacement drugs, and they started to make this drug that Spruce has now. And BioMarin's a big market cap company, 10 billion market cap, but it's been a real dog over the years. I think management's not been so great. So BioMarin, continues to chuck out these orphan drugs, but they want something bigger. And so they developed the hemophilia gene therapy treatment. And they're convinced this is going to be the biggest drug maybe of all time. Hemophilia is the bleeding disease, similar to enzyme replacement, but in this case it's factor replacement. You can't make these coagulation factors, and so the patient in hemophilia bleeds. And so what ends up happening is this bleeding is uncontrolled, and you need to replace the factor with recombinant factors, and often you have to take them every day and self-inject. Nowadays you can do twice a week or once a week even in some cases, but hemophilia is a lifelong disease. They developed a drug called Valrox that was supposed to be a cure. It's a gene therapy, you take it once. They thought it would be a multi-billion-dollar drug, at least $4 or $5 billion, right? So they decided to sell a lot of their stuff and no longer develop a lot of their stuff. They sold Firdapse to Catalyst, which is CPRX. So they basically gave this drug away to CPRX. And CPRX market cap, $2.5 billion now. They just gave it away. It made no sense. They had Firdapse globally, but they gave the US rights away to this company Catalyst. Catalyst said, thank you, we'll get this approved, and $2.5 billion free. BioMarin could have kept it, and they would have had $12.5 billion market cap instead of $10 billion. But no, they wanted to go all in on Valrox. So they sold the Spruce drug as well to a private company for nothing. They gave it away. And they said, Valrox is going to make us, a huge company like Alnylam or Regeneron or something like that. Well, Valrox was a dud. Almost nobody takes it. People are comfortable with their factor injections. Valrox doesn't work over really long periods of time, so it's not really a lifelong cure, but it works pretty well. And it's just something that they fucked up. So now Spruce has this enzyme replacement therapy from BioMarin, and again, is it going to make them the next Alnylam or Regeneron? No. Spruce is going to look more like the next Catalyst, where they have a nice little drug that is going to do a few $100 million in revenue, and that's it. What's a few $100 million in revenue worth in biopharma land? Maybe 5 times sales, and 5 times a few hundred is $1 billion. If it's $400 million in revenue, well, that's $2 billion. So it's going to be one of those. And right now it's trading for $250 million, and you do have to discount back those future prices. But in general, it's pretty much what you see is what you get. I will say this drug's a little bit different for a few reasons. One, it's given by what's called an Ommaya reservoir, Ommaya shunt. So it's a flap that's created in the brain. I'll show you how it works, but you guys may not like to see this, so look away if you're squeamish. But my my first chief medical officer taught me this. Is we were going to develop a brain drug, and I said, how are we going to get this into the brain? And he says, let's do Omaya. I said, what the fuck is Omaya? This is 10 plus years ago. You know, shout out to Chris James. And he says, yeah, just show me how it's done. And he says, well, it's this flap. And I said, is that really going to work? And he said, it's done. It's done a lot. And you can see, you know, the head's shaved and the flap is created. And you can inject drugs into there. I mean, this is literally, you know, the idea. So ultimately, that reservoir is what's needed here. And, you know, it's not terrible if you're dying. And patients with this disease die very young. Most probably won't make it to 21. So you have to use the Omaya in this case because there's enzymes are big molecules that don't cross the blood-brain barrier very easily. And this is largely a brain disease. The other lysosomal storage diseases, interestingly, many of them affect the brain as well. But patients take the IV because, you know, that's all they've got. And it's sad because the brain is a target organ for a lot of those other lysosomal storage diseases. And some people have experimented off-label, unapproved, with intrathecal delivery, which is through the spinal column, kind of where you take a lumbar puncture, and they insert the drug through there. But Sanfilippo B, this disease, is very, very specifically kind of a brain disease. So by giving the drug intracerebroventricular through the Omaya, that's sort of how you get the drug there. And what's amazing is these patients, again, they can't metabolize this. Maybe I can show you the enzymatic reaction of that's so funny, cerebrotendinous symptomatosis is this other one. Glucocerebrosidase. And so here's the simple enzymatic reaction. Should be it, right? I just want the image, man. All right. So hopefully you can see this. Let's see if you can see this, sort of. Okay, you can see it. So this is the substrate. Glucocerebroside. Glucocerebroside. And you can see it's a fatty acid with sphingosine and a sugar here. And so the enzyme goes in there and clips the sugar off. And then the fatty acid, sphingosine, is metabolized by something else. But you need this enzyme. You miss this enzyme and this bad boy, the whole thing, will accumulate in many of the cells in your body, if not every cell, in the lysosome. It's going to cause a huge problem as it accumulates and accumulates and there's no way. I mean, look at this, hugely polar and hugely non-polar regions. You know, this is like a very amphiphilic kind of disgusting molecule that will agglomerate and you can, in some cases, I mean, it's a really distended sort of cell that's filling up with this shit. And breaking it apart allows, you know, we have many enzymes that'll not just metabolize glucose, but repurpose it into energy, and then also repurpose the fatty acid into energy. So you have this really terrible situation. And, but when you have the enzyme, this thing clips. So you just measure how much of this do you see in the body. And in the case of the spruce drug, as I showed in the tweet I made yesterday, the patients, their levels of the gunk drop to normal. And that's what's killing them. So it's pretty amazing. Biotech can be a wonderful thing. It's one of the reasons I got into the industry. But, you know, no drug's perfect. And there are not many people with this disease. Now, one thing about rare diseases that I've learned over 20 years of following them is that when there's a treatment for a disease, even especially a very rare disease, people start to get diagnosed more and more. It's a very odd dynamic, but it's kind of a statistical thing where you may not respond to a survey if you don't know what disease the patient has. And if you know what disease the patient has and now there's a treatment for it, you're kind of more aware of it, and you might respond to the survey and say, actually, yeah, I do have 3 people with Sanfilippo B. Where somebody asks, do you have any patients with cerebrotendinous xanthomatosis? You might say, no, I never heard of that. But if the company's out there doing trials, reminding you to look for patients, oh yeah, Sanfilippo B, I know 2 patients with that. I thought there was nothing for them. No, there's a new drug for it? Oh, amazing, great. We'll get them under treatment right away. So you end up finding double, triple, quadruple. In fact, Gaucher disease from Genzyme, the first ever drug of its kind, that started this enzyme replacement therapy revolution. And this is why this stock's so easy to understand, is that Wall Street, behind me, is very used to lysosomal storage diseases. Everyone my age cut their teeth on these lysosomal storage diseases because there were a bunch of stocks that dealt with them. These days there aren't really anymore, because many of them that could be treated got treated, but now we got a new one. But in the old days, we spent a lot of our time on Wall Street looking at these stocks. So in any event, we got a new one, but this is so easy to understand because it's like Fast and Furious. This is just the Fast and Furious 8, Fast and Furious 9. You know what you're dealing with. Enzyme replacements are really easy to understand once you understand the first one. So anyway, the point I was making is that Cerezyme started off where they said they were only going to see 500 patients. They thought they'd see 500 patients. They ended up treating 5,000 patients on drug right now, or at least at peak. They made new treatments that replaced, I wouldn't say replaced Cerezyme, but took some patients away from Cerezyme. So, they found 10 times more patients with Gaucher than they thought they'd find. And again, if a disease gets more awareness, people start to find it. And it's a good thing. The company makes more money, but more importantly, more and more people get treated. The case with toxoplasmosis, one of the reasons that raised, it's going to be the case with toxoplasmosis. One of the reasons that raised the price was to raise awareness of the disease and make more treatments for it and do all kinds of things. There's a healthy symbiosis with the drug industry and physicians. And of course, it can be corrupted by companies like Purdue or whatever, but at the end of the day, the more people, for rare diseases, the more people that know about them, the more companies out there helping folks understand rare diseases, I think the better, but that's a longer story. In some cases, with CTX, it was really important to get the word out there that this disease even existed, because nobody really had ever heard of it. And CTX, if you don't treat it early, you get irreversible damage. And enzyme replacement therapies, that's the case too. So you might say, what does a drug company have to do with educating doctors? Well, you go to med school, you don't remember every damn rare disease you learned about. And again, with cerebrotendinous xanthomatosis or pentatheniate kinase associated neurodegeneration or FSGS, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, these are some of the diseases that I either made the first drug for ever or acquired the first drug ever. And these diseases, you go to med school, you're never going to remember these diseases again. There's 7,000 human diseases. Nobody can name them all. Nobody except me. But the point is that, reminding doctors with even just a flyer, or in the case of CTX, what we did was CTX causes irreversible brain damage. And we got patients, but before that happens, they get glaucoma. So we told eye doctors, watch your glaucoma patients, they might have CTX. And even if one kid, juvenile glaucoma, adolescent glaucoma, even if one kid has glaucoma that gets referred to go on our drug, well, drug's very expensive, so that's nice for us, but you save the kid from mental retardation. So who's going to tell the ophthalmologists, hey, watch out, if you got kids with glaucoma that are unexplained, they could have CTX. Ophthalmologists don't know anything about this disease. They don't even know what it stands for or what it means. So educating them with medical symposia, flyers, things like that, just reminding them, probably saved lives. and made us money too. So there's a little bit of that goes on where, that's one of the ways you find these patients. A lot of times with rare diseases, it takes 10 years to get diagnosed, and people give up. They don't know what's going on. The other interesting thing is the rare disease business is a global business. This is not well understood, is that the US is just one country. It's usually the biggest country, but it's not the whole pie. In fact, for some rare diseases, it's only 30% of revenue. That's unusual in pharma. Usually it's much, much, much bigger. This could be as much as 80% in some cases. And you might say, well, Martin, these are $500,000 drugs. How in the world does anybody else afford them? It's a fascinating question. In Brazil, you're constitutionally guaranteed healthcare. And rare disease companies will sue the Brazilian government. They'll actually work with the patient, sue the Brazilian government and say, I'm constitutionally obligated to receive this drug. It's $500,000. You have to pay. The government of Brazil has to pay. Now, Brazil's a big country. A lot of people live there. So Brazil is often the number 2 or number 3 rare disease market. Rare diseases are also big where there's intermarriage or consanguineous reproduction, inbreeding. And in the Middle East, there's often consanguineous, reproduction. And that can often lead to some of these rare diseases. So you go to these big population countries. Now there's some that just can't afford it, like Nigeria, Pakistan, Indonesia. They're not great, but oftentimes, when it's paid for at the government level, there's often this willingness to pay for this one-off thing, especially if it's a dying kid. Most countries have a GDP. They got serious treasury. They can send a check for $1 million or $2 million, and you collect that from every country for the 5 kids here, the 25 kids in Italy, the 7 kids in Slovenia. They'll pay, and it may take some time, but they'll pay. And you also give the drug. You do the right thing. If they don't pay, they don't pay, but you get them onto treatment, no matter what. In terms of prevalence, again, you never know how many people have these diseases. And if you look at the history of the other ERTs, the average ERT, that was at least on the Spruce slide, shows roughly 400 million in revenue. And one of the things you could do, again, you're talking to the guy who did it, is if the incidence prevalence is a little lower than you thought, you bump the price a little bit. In terms of making the patient funnel and modeling it, you have the prevalence, which is people with the disease, and then you have 2 changes every year. How many people are born and how many people die. And that's it. So people who are born, you're going to want them on treatment right away. People who die are no longer modelable in your revenue estimates, sadly, for both them and the company. But the younger people will do better because they're going to be treated right away. The older patients might have irreversible damage. They still might get treated in an attempt to, prolong their life, hopefully. So anyway, that's kind of the story of these drugs. But again, the story of BioMarin holding on to all, building this great portfolio of small rare disease drugs, and then saying, screw it, we don't want them anymore, let's just go for the gold, we're bored, we need a big drug. And they kind of ruined, in a lot of ways, ruined their company. So, really crazy thing that they did. It's almost, surprising they didn't even go more all in and sell the current portfolio. But they just basically said, we're not going to develop any more of these, so let's give them over to other smaller companies. So when I say patients per year, it's really just how many patients are on drug, because it's every year you got to pay. And if the company feels there are not going to be that many patients, maybe you charge $750,000. If you feel there are going to be a lot of patients, maybe you charge $300,000. There's weight-based dosing as well. It's not a trick, but it's often what's done. A little baby needs less drug than an adult. But you do the weight-based dosing on the price it for the baby or the child, and as the child grows, that $300,000 customer might be a $600,000 customer. That's what happened with Naglazyme. So there's a lot of ways to make sure kind of you're going to get the revenue you want. Now, if it's a truly rare disease like Sly syndrome, which is MPS 7, MPS is mucopolysaccharidosis. It's very similar to lysosomal. It is lysosomal storage disease, but it's its own class. And MPS 7 has a drug called Mepsevii, which only sells 20 million in revenue because there's like 8 people who have this disease. And that's fine. But, for Sanfilippo B, I mean, we know there's hundreds of people at the very least that have the disease, and more likely, just in the US, I think, and more likely than that, there's maybe 1,000 people globally that could take it and pay for it. So I think it's going to be a pretty handsome drug. But, and the team from Spruce worked at BioMarin, so it's a pretty good management team and board in that regard. So we'll see how it goes, but it's a good long. It's not the only long. There's Unicure, Abivax, Sarepta. There's a bunch of stocks I like. So it's not like there's one stock to rule them all. I think anybody who tells you to go all in on one thing it's not doing you any favors.